Buenas tardes, good afternoon to one and all who have joined us today for this webinar. My name is Carlos Vargas Ramos, and I am the Center for Puerto Rican Studies Director of Public Policy, External and Media Relations, and I will be serving as your Master of Ceremonies this afternoon for the Puerto Rican Status Archives Project, a history of federal status legislation for Puerto Rico, 1898 to the present. On behalf of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, I welcome you to this webinar on the work by Dr. Charles Venator Santiago. The Puerto Rican Status Archives Project, A History of Federal Status Legislation for Puerto Rico, 1898 to the present, is an initiative to create a public repository of documents addressing the history of the political status legislation for Puerto Rico. This website provides an overview of some of the preliminary findings from the Center's initial efforts to analyze all the federal status legislations debated in Congress from 1898 to the present in the hands of Professor Venator Santiago. This webinar is meant to introduce to the public the Puerto Rican Status Archives projects and its potential uses. This presentation is part of the Central Journal e-journal initiatives, which is an initiative insofar as expanding the availability for dissemination of the work produced and facilitated by the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. The Central e-journal is a peer review journal that publishes original contributions to Puerto Rican history and culture as interactive and multimedia digital exhibitions. It will be fully devoted to promoting central archival collections and other digital content, to increasing connections to Puerto Rican studies, scholars, curators, and artists, to support historical and cultural preservation, and to educate about and to share broadly the Puerto Rican experience. We are seeking proposals for digital humanities projects that contribute to the historical and cultural preservation of Puerto Rican studies, is relevant to the field of Puerto Rican studies and the academic community, have a connection to and contribute to the Centro's library and archives, and have a multimedia content to support users' interactivity. The Central e-journals has a three-step assessment process. The first one requires that potential contributors submit a project proposal to the Central e-journal using the submission guidelines for authors and creators. Second, once the proposal has been accepted based on a peer review recommendation, the exhibit curators or authors will submit content as detailed in the proposal as possible. The Central e-journal staff is committed to supporting the exhibit development and complete the uploading of the content. Third and finally, once the uploading and copyrights clearance process has been concluded, the link to the unpublished exhibit is sent to the peer review panel for a final evaluation. Reviewers will read and review all the materials and confirm that their recommendations is in the stage of the process that allows it to be ready for publication and exhibition. Once the exhibit is ready for publications, we encourage authors to submit a summative and interpretative article about the exhibit to the Central Journal from the Central Archives sections. And if you have any questions, you may certainly reach out to us at centralejournal@hunter.cuny.edu. Today's presentation will run in two parts. One pre-recorded presentation by Dr. Charles Venator Santiago, followed by a commentary from Dr. Jose Javier Colon Morera. After that commentary by Dr. Colon, we will run another presentation by Dr. Venator, followed by a second commentary by Dr. Colon. Now, I would like to introduce our features presenters this evening. We have Charles Venator Santiago, who is an associate professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and El Instituto at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. He works on questions of U.S. territorial law and policy. He is the coordinator of the Puerto Rico Citizenship Archives Project and author of Hostages of Empire, A Short History of the Extension of U.S. Citizenship to Puerto Rico, 1898 to the present, as well as Puerto Rico and the Origins of U.S. Global Empire, the Disembodied Shade. In addition to Dr. Venator, we are joined by Dr. Jose Javier Colon Morera, a political scientist who has extensively researched the political status questions of Puerto Rico and the human rights issues regarding Puerto Rico's territorial status. He was chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus, and teaches courses and seminars on Puerto Rico, U.S. Political relations, human rights, and international relations. His book, Puerto Rico y los Derechos Humanos, una intersección plural, was co-edited with Itza Alegría Ortega and was recognized by the Pen Club of Puerto Rico as the best collective nonfiction book of the year. Colon Morera has published extensively on U.S. Puerto Rico relations in journals such as PS, Caribbean Studies, Latin American Perspective, and Nueva Sociedad, among others. At the present time, Colon Morera is involved in a research initiative of the University of Puerto Rico about the implications of the 100th anniversary of Balzac versus Puerto Rico, one of the most relevant insular cases of the U.S. Supreme Court. We therefore welcome Drs. Venator and Colon.
My name is Charles Venator Santiago. I'm an associate professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and El Instituto at the University of Connecticut. And today I want to talk to you about the Puerto Rico Status Archives Project, a project that I've been working with some students, including Stavros Papadopoulos, who helped me put together this presentation. I want to talk to you about e-journal project that gives you a history of federal status legislation for Puerto Rico debated in Congress from 1898 to the present. So let me give you a little bit of an overview about the project and context in Puerto Rico so that you can understand how the Puerto Rico Status Archives projects fits in the overall project. So the United States annexed Puerto Rico in 1898 and simultaneously invented a new territorial status describing the archipelago as an unincorporated territory, a distinction that does not exist in the US Constitution. The so-called unincorporated territory or territorial status, Congress, the executive, and the Supreme Court argued, established that Puerto Rico and other unincorporated territories were not meant to become states. Congress has never enacted legislation expressly changing Puerto Rico's territorial status or creating a procedure to do so. Notwithstanding, Congress has debated upwards of 141 bills and laws addressing different dimensions of Puerto Rico's territorial status and possible mechanisms to resolve the archipelago's future political status. The Puerto Rico Status Archives Project, or PRSAP, is an initiative to create a public archive or repository of legislative histories of the federal debates over the island's political status. The Puerto Rico Status Archives Project is designed to serve as a public repository of documents under the format of CENTROS, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies e-journal project. During our initial phase, our intent is to provide a narrative guide and access to all federal legislation and bills debated in Congress and addressing Puerto Rico's future political status. In addition, we plan to generate sufficient resources to aid, expand, clarify debates over the possible future political status of Puerto Rico. The e-journal format gives us a great forum or allows us to expand, modify, correct, and constantly update this repository of documents as new documents or new legislation comes out. let me give you a little bit of a context of the kinds of work that we're going to include in this project. Presently, we analyzed 141 bills and laws containing provisions addressing the resolution of Puerto Rico's political status. We developed upwards of 30 categories to analyze each bill, including who sponsored the bill or bill sponsorship, party affiliation, committees, type of legislation, status options, citizenship provisions, voting options, who can participate in plebiscites, and so on and so forth, and what types of legislative actions. Was this bill introduced in a committee, in the House, in the Senate? Did it move from one house to another? And again, the idea is to provide a comprehensive database that hopefully in the future will be searchable, which allows individuals to search into the database or repository of bills and find targeted information or find patterns that can aid in future research on the status question of Puerto Rico. We've decided to organize the PRSAP, or the Puerto Rico Status Archives Project, by periods, providing a basic discussion of the types of bills in each relevant Congress. And these periods include the third view, or the moment in which the United States invents a new territorial status to acquire Puerto Rico, and the process through which that territorial status takes place, and the different Congresses that are situated within that period. The initial colonization period, which is from 1904 to 1922, and again, the congressional debates that take place during that period, a period of crisis and turbulence that occurs between the 1920s and 1946, a period essentially informed not just by the Great Depression, but also by efforts in Puerto Rico to pursue independence, the expansion of the administrative state, which is from 1946 to 1960, which is a period in which Puerto Rico receives increased autonomic control over its internal affairs. And there's a constitution that is enacted, and the Puerto Ricans acquire the right to elect their own governor. Following that period, fifth period is considered the period of the compact and the calls for self-determination. This is a period in large measure informed by international debates and by efforts to modify the compact of free association that was debated in Congress. And I'll explain that. That's a very controversial term. And then, of course, decolonial visions that emerged after 1989, or the plebiscitatory debates that emerged as a result of the 1989 to 1990 plebiscitary process. And that period encompasses debates that took place in that moment, as well as contemporary debates that are taking place right now. So what I want to do in this presentation is give you a sample of some of the key findings that we've been able to ascertain from this database and from this research. And the idea is, again, to give you an overview of some of the work that you can look for, or sort of get or sort of expand on. Again, this is a project that is designed to be a research aid for scholars or layperson who's interested in learning more about the history of Puerto Rico and the status or relevant political status debates. So let me give you a couple sample findings, and I'll start with first with the type of legislation. As I argued before, between 1898 and the present, Congress has debated 141 bills containing some sort of status provision or some sort of provision that addresses the status of Puerto Rico. This includes amendments to the Compact of Free Association, budget legislation, congressional enactments, consultation legislation, organic acts, organic act amendments, plebiscitary legislation, public laws, referendum legislation, resolutions, and status legislation. And again, let me clarify a notion of terms before I explain this first finding. I use the word compact because that's the language of the law. In reality, as the reports or the behind-the-scenes information suggests, Congress never changed Puerto Rico's territorial status, even though it uses the language of the compact to describe the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States in the aftermath of the 1952 congressional debates. From a constitutional perspective, this is an irrelevant conversation because even though it was a public discussion, there was no constitutional debate affirming an actual change in the status of Puerto Rico. The three top bills that were introduced in Congress that address the question of status are status legislation. These are bills that are designed to unilaterally change Puerto Rico's status from an unincorporated territory to a sovereign nation, an independent country, or to a state. And 61 bills were introduced, or 43% of all the legislation debated. Almost a third of the legislation debated in Congress focused on status legislation. Referendum legislation is a distinct type of legislation that gives voters a right to choose or vote on a question, an affirmative or negative question. I agree with the status or disagree. I agree with this mechanism or disagree. And finally, the third major option is the plebiscitatory legislation, which gives voters in Puerto Rico, and in some cases in the United States, we'll return to that question later, essentially an opportunity to choose among multiple options, status options for Puerto Rico. And the idea is that electors or voters in Puerto Rico will be given a forum or a poll or a vote or an opportunity to choose between, say, for example, independence, the status quo, statehood, or none of the above in some instances. What we do know from this particular type of research is that the majority of bills that have been introduced in Congress are status bills that simply ask, take a position or change the status of Puerto Rico in this direction or that direction. Let's wrap up this first part of the presentation so we can entertain some questions and address some concerns and explore some of these debates, and then we'll return to the second part of the conversation in a minute.
It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you today. This is a very important initiative, and I want to start congratulating Charles Robert Venator for his hard work putting in place a very important information regarding the political status of Puerto Rico, which is still an unresolved issue, as you all know. It is an important, and I also to commend Dr. Edwin Melendez that for having the vision of leading this effort. I think it's an important contribution for El Centro to a data-driven analysis of the so-called political status problem in Puerto Rico. This is an issue, as you know, where many people have many opinions, but many times those opinions are not backed by data, by information, by reading the whole history. And we are about to have some activities now regarding the Balzac decision, which is a 1922 decision by Judge Taft, which was also president of the United States. And we're doing that because in that decision, Balzac versus Puerto Rico, 1922, the Supreme Court of the United States held that there would not be in the future any change in the political status of Puerto Rico unless there was a clear mandate by U.S. Congress to do so in the form of express legislation. So as the current law, federal law, is in place, the only body that can generate some kind of change in the non-incorporated relation between Puerto Rico and the United States that was declared by the Supreme Court in 1900. It is the only body that under federal law has jurisdiction to change the current political status. So in many ways, the Supreme Court deferred to U.S. Congress on the problem, and many times when the issue of political status has been brought to the courts have used Balzac to say, no, this is an issue that has to be addressed by Congress. So in this sense, to have a repository of all the attempts that U.S. Congress has about this issue is an extremely useful tool. The other contribution that I would emphasize of this project that Venator Santiago is presenting today is that it has a long-term historical context. You simply cannot understand the political status issue of Puerto Rico if you don't go back to the Foraker Organic Act. You cannot understand why Puerto Ricans were first Puerto Rican citizens and then American citizens in 1917 by the Jones Act, or why the resident commissioner of Puerto Rico has a title that is resident commissioner, not delegate, as many other delegates of the territories would have later on. So to understand this legislation from a historical perspective is tremendously important. Also, this project is a systematic approach, not necessarily focused on one particular period. Many scholars have devoted more time and energy to the creation of Commonwealth between 1950 and 1952. Or some scholars have devoted more energy to study the 1917 Jones Act and why of the US citizenship at that point. Some now are considering with more precision the Promesa legislation. But this allows us to take a view of not only the legislation that has been approved, but many of the attempts, of the failed attempts to deal with this issue. As you know, Congress has never been able to create a process by which Congress is able to define what are the political options for Puerto Rico. Political parties have requested this many times in history, and many times Congress have refused to do so. The other contribution that I would emphasize is the accessibility of this information. Many times we talk about self-determination, we talk about transparency, we talk about the need to have the citizen empowered with information, but many times the documents that are needed to evaluate these political controversies are not there. So that's also very important. The other aspect that I would like to emphasize is that this project will be very helpful to study the internal tendencies and mechanisms of the political institutional body, which is Congress, that exerts so much influence over Puerto Rico's decision-making process. We say that the status question under Balzac has to be, Congress has to act in order to change the political status, but many times we don't understand the complexity of Congress, of 435 representatives, 100 senators from different constituencies, from different sources of information, from where a more centralized House of Representatives, a more individual oriented Senate. So this is going to help to understand better the U.S. Congress. In terms of the language that is being used regarding political status, Robert spoke about a compact, a bilateral compact. It is true that in the the 1950-52 process, the legislation talked about the Commonwealth being in the nature of a compact. But that language was not as important as the language that was used in 1953 at the UN. Because at the UN, when the United States was trying to get Puerto Rico out of the list of dependent territories, the representation that was made internationally was that the ELA, the Commonwealth, was a compact. And a compact, the way that one of the representatives of the US delegation put it to the delegates was far stronger than a treaty, because it could not be amended if both Puerto Rico and US were not agreeing to such a process. So that's also something that is very useful to reflect upon when we consider these issues. How much time do I have?
You can continue. You can continue for a minute or so.
Okay, thank you. Let me read what Mason Sears said at the UN. A most interesting feature of the new constitution is that it was entered into the nature of a compact between the American and the Puerto Rican people. A compact, as you know, is far stronger than a treaty. A treaty can be denounced by either side, whereas a compact cannot be denounced by either party unless it has permission of the other. So it's very interesting, and this is a final thought. When you study Congress at the same time, and you study congressional records, congressional committees, congressional debates, you also have to be very aware of the historical context that is happening, and to what extent the representations that are made to the domestic opinion, public opinion in the United States is different to the representations that are made to the international forums like the United Nations. So I would leave it here, but I again would like to congratulate Robert for this excellent initiative.
Welcome back. One of the questions that we've been interested in trying to figure out is whether there was a particular political party that supported one approach or the other. We find that the American Labor Right Party, which is a New York-based party primarily, not exclusively, at the time by Vito Marcantonio, its main representative was Representative Vito Marcantonio, introduced a number of status legislation or bills before 1952. We also know that the Democrats preferred status legislation and then referendum legislation and plebiscitary legislation before 1952. In contrast, we know that Republicans supported status legislation but preferred plebiscitary legislation over referendum legislation. And this is interesting because it suggests that different political parties may have an interest in different ways of resolving the political status of Puerto Rico, at least before 1952. After 1952, when we essentially have two parties, we find that Democrats overwhelmingly support the idea of status legislation to resolve the question of status of Puerto Rico. And that means that Puerto Ricans are given a choice in some instances, or that Congress simply makes a unilateral decision over the status of Puerto Rico in one direction or another. And after that, Democrats prefer referendum legislation and plebiscitary legislation as the third option. In contrast, again, Republicans prefer status legislation and then plebiscitary legislation, giving voters an option. And then their last choice is referendum legislation. Again, as we will see in other data in a moment, the question is there one mechanism that's better than the other for one political party or legislator? We also tried to figure out where and under what circumstances bills are introduced in Congress historically, at least since 1898. And we came up with this way of sort of documenting or trying to figure out whether there's unitary government. If you go below 0, -1 or -0.1, 0.5, or -0.5, what that is telling us is that Republicans control to varying degrees the House. Above 0, or the calculation above 0 suggests that, or documents that Democrats control the House, and again, to varying degrees. And what we find is that on average, when the Republicans control the House, what they'll introduce is budget legislation or organic acts. Whereas when Democrats control the House, you'll see a great majority of different types of bills, particularly status and referendum and plebiscitary bills. And again, the argument here is that when Democrats are in control of the House, you're more likely to see more legislation in favor of a change in the status of Puerto Rico. What happens when the Senate is controlled by one political party or another? And again, we have the same argument that we see in the House. When the Senate is controlled by Democrats, you have more, on average, legislation than when the Republicans control the Senate. We have more support in the Senate for status legislation, plebiscitary laws, and referendum legislation. And this is really important because, as I'll explain later, most status bills die in the Senate. Most status bills are introduced in the House, but they end up in the cemetery in the Senate. So what happens when the executive or the presidency is controlled by one party or another? One of the interesting findings that we've been able to identify is that when the executive is controlled by the Republican or by a Republican administration, you're more likely to see bills introduced that address amendments to the so-called Compact of Free Association, organic acts, and plebiscitary legislation. In contrast, when Democrats control the executive, you're more likely to see every other legislation. And this is important, or it's interesting for a number of reasons. One of which is that from a historical point of view, a lot of governments oftentimes complain that they represent one party, and the president and at the helm at the time, or the president controlling the executive, oftentimes is from an opposing party, particularly at a federal level, but sometimes at a local level. In other words, you may have a governor who identifies as a pro-statehooder or in favor of statehood in Puerto Rico, who may be facing a president who is not necessarily in favor of statehood, but identifies as a Democrat. And you may have a local governor who is a Republican now having to deal with a president who represents the Democratic Party. And the flip happens. You may have, in some instances, some governors from the Popular Democratic Party who affiliate with the Democratic Party at a national level, but have to deal with a Republican president. The point is that what we know historically is that on average, Republican presidents are more likely to support plebiscitary legislation than Democratic or presidents. Likewise, what we know on average is that Democratic presidents are more likely to support referendum and status legislation. And this is important because it gives you a sense of the kinds of initiatives that might be popular with one executive or another. But what happens when you have a unified government? A unified government meaning the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the President are controlled by one party or another. And again, these are all averages. But on average, what we see is that Democrats introduce most types of bills except budget legislation and organic acts during these periods. And while there are some instances of introducing organic acts when there was a Democratic-controlled House, Senate, or executive, on average, they were introduced when there were at least 2 Republican-controlled institutions. Interestingly, there were more bills introduced when there was an average Democratic unified government. In other words, when Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the executive, it is more likely to see the introduction of different status legislation, plebiscitary legislation, or referendum legislation addressing Puerto Rico's political status. What about states? Are particular bills coming from one state or another? One of the interesting findings is that there were 27 or represented or lawmakers from 27 states that introduced legislation for Puerto Rico. But lawmakers from 4 states introduced more than 6 bills, and resident commissioners, of course, of Puerto Rico introduced the majority of bills, closely followed by New York. In other words, when we look at how many bills have been introduced, we find that obviously resident commissioners from Puerto Rico have introduced most of the bills. But next to that is New York, with 27 bills that have been introduced throughout this period of time. And that's interesting for a number of reasons, because it affirms the commitment of New York lawmakers to Puerto Rico, a historical commitment, and it confirms also a particular kind of relationship. In the case of Maryland, there were 7 bills, and that's a little bit of an outlier, and I'll explain more about that later, but that's, I'll explain a little bit more in the next slide. And in the case of California, 11 bills were introduced primarily by Ronald Dellums, and I'll say more about that in a second, as well as Alaska. And again, these 2 are outliers to the extent that there are single lawmakers that have introduced the majority of the bills addressing the status of Puerto Rico. In terms of what lawmakers have introduced most bills in the case of Puerto Rico, Ronald Dellums, who had a particular relationship with Juan Maribras, a historical relationship, introduced 8 bills in Congress, primarily self-determination bills. And again, only 5 lawmakers in Congress and the resident commissioner have introduced more than 6 bills each. Resident Commissioner Santiago Iglesias Pantin, a socialist and member of the coalition party, introduced 7 bills in his period, primarily before 1952, while he was serving as resident commissioner. Don Young, representative from Alaska, has introduced at least 7 bills that address some dimensions of the status. He is an advocate of statehood, like resident commissioner Santiago Iglesias Pantin. Senator Miller Tidings, who supported independence for Puerto Rico, also supported plebiscitary legislation that included a particular interesting status, namely the dominionism status, following the British model. And then, of course, resident commissioner Antonio Fernández-Sorin, who was he was elected in the aftermath of the creation of the Popular Democratic Party and before and after the enactment of the Puerto Rican Constitution. And he was one of the more influential resident commissioners and statesmen in Puerto Rican politics. But what we know is that we have different instances where lawmakers, particularly a handful of lawmakers, have introduced a significant amount of status legislation primarily. And again, the outlier here, or the 2 outliers here, are Senator Miller Tidings, who introduced plebiscites in addition to independence bills, and resident commissioner Antonio Fernández-Sorin, who introduced constitutional amendments and amendments to the so-called Compact of Free Association as established by the legislation. Anyway, this is a sample of the kind of work that we can find. There's other information that you can discern, including committee sponsorships, the types of committees, the types of bills, the types of legislative actions, and so on and so forth. But what we wanted to do with this presentation is give you a little bit of a sample of what you can expect once we've completed the Puerto Rico Status Archives project. As in terms of preliminary conclusions or other preliminary conclusions, I want to highlight that this database can help us glean or understand a number of other historical patterns addressing the status of Puerto Rico. For example, although federal lawmakers have debated upwards of 141 bills and laws addressing Puerto Rico's political status since 1898, Congress has never enacted any legislation providing for the solution of Puerto Rico's political status. At most, it has enacted organic acts, which are designed to sort of govern Puerto Rico or rule different dimensions of Puerto Rico. While the majority of status bills have been introduced in the House, senators appear to prefer plebiscitary options. And this is really important because, again, most legislation, status legislation for Puerto Rico, and by status legislation, I mean status designed to solve the future political status of Puerto Rico, most of this legislation dies in the Senate. In the few instances, we're still trying to figure that out, but in 4 or 5 instances where some debates have moved from the House onto the Senate, it dies in the Senate. And this is particularly prevalent in the 1989 plebiscitary, 1989 to 1990, 91 plebiscitary process. And again, Most legislation has been introduced by either Puerto Rican resident commissioners or New York lawmakers. In addition to that, the most comprehensive legislation included clear definitions of alternative status options for Puerto Rico. When you look at congressional legislation, there are instances where lawmakers define what they mean by independence, by statehood, by Commonwealth, by an alternative to Commonwealth, etc. And those have been the most comprehensive bills that have been debated and have moved in Congress and in the Senate. Most plebiscitary legislation contain provisions explicitly binding Congress to an outcome, implicitly binding Congress to an outcome. And again, in the case of plebiscitary legislation, particularly before 1952, we have clearly defined status options with transition provisions. So when lawmakers read the bill, they understood what they were signing up for. They agreed to a particular status and the outcome of the status, particularly in the transition provisions. That is different than plebiscitary legislation, which leaves these questions up for debate, whether it's through a status convention or a constitutional convention or another option. A significant amount of plebiscitary legislation also contains substantive transition provisions. And again, something that's really important is that before lawmakers sign into a status provision, they need to understand, is statehood going to be the most expensive status option for the United States? Because statehood requires parity funding and statehood requires a degree of equality that other options do not. Is independence going to be cheap because we break the ties with Puerto Rico and let people find their own future? Or are we going to have some sort of transition period where there's some money transferred? What we also know is that Democrats are more likely to support self-determination and other democratic procedures to resolve Puerto Rico's political status. And this is interesting because it appears that Democrats are more likely, on the one hand, to support more democratic options, whereas Republicans are more likely, on the other hand, and again, in a small instance, to support mechanisms that are more democratic, particularly plebiscitary legislation. Okay, I hope this gives you a sense of the kind of work that we're trying to do. I hope this gives you a better sense of the Puerto Rico Status Archives Project. And I welcome any kind of conversation.
A current debate on the status question that relates in part to what Robert has been presenting up to now. There was a recent report from the Justice Department defining what were the options of political status and trying basically to tell Congress that what it has to do about this issue. It's going to be interesting in the future to see whether Congress has its own ideas of how to proceed on these issues, because as I told you before, it is under constitutional law of the United States, it is Congress' duty to define future options of political development of Puerto Rico. When Balzac was deciding in 1922, there was no clear sense of self-determination as a political principle that had to prevail. But now there is a political discourse in the United States favoring self-determination, and there is also a legal international responsibility under the norms of the United Nations to give way to a self-determination process. Some recommendations that I would venture with some of you that probably are interested in researching this topic is look for consistent patterns. Up to now, there has been a consistent gradual colonial policy on the part of the United States of making gradual changes when situation in Puerto Rico changes or there's a need to affirm some political interest or economic interest in the island. And that up to now, there are some periods also that can be taken into consideration: the Organic Acts, the Foraker Act in 1900, Jones Act in 1917, Law 600 that created ELA, and now the Promesa legislation. With many of us think that is a new stage, a new way of looking into the Puerto Rican problem, to the extent that now Congress has much more control over internal budgetary affairs of Puerto Rico. So look at the long-term patterns and the changes that happen in some particular occasions. Another important recommendation that I would venture here is that many times is as important as it is to understand what Congress is doing. It is very important to understand the ecology under which Congress is operating, and what are the forces that are making Congress decide to go into one direction or the other. Promesa is a very interesting case study in this sense, because the amount of pressure that the Obama administration, that the Treasury Department made to have that legislation approved, and the amount of pressure that came from bondholders that were very afraid of a process of dealing with the debt that was not under federal control. Some sectors of the Republican Party that were more interested in somehow punishing Puerto Rico because it had been irresponsible in the dealings with the economic issues and the budgetary issues and the lack of accountability. And the Democrats being told by the Treasury and by other sectors, either you do this or Puerto Rico will collapse. So this is the only option. There were intense pressures that came from, in a way, outside Congress, but had a decisive influence. So as important as it is to study Congress as an institution, is to study the ecology, the ecological system, if you can say, that has a lot of things to say about what Congress is doing. And by that I mean think tanks, pressure groups. In the case of Puerto Rico, the manufacturing sector that is still very present in the island. And also, of course, more and more crucial participation on the part of the diaspora voters, who are, some of them, in positions to influence the electoral outcomes in the United States. Which leads me to the next point, which is be very conscious of the fact that a principle that helps to explain many congressional decisions is what congressional expert David Mayhew called the electoral connection. How is that the position that I'm taking in a particular issue is affecting my chances for election or re-election? If I don't get elected or re-elected, none of the other actions that I take as a legislature would take place. So according to Mayhew and all the students of Mayhew that have followed this line of reasoning, you have to be very, give a lot of attention to the electoral connection issue. We made a study at the University of Puerto Rico in the 90s. And basically and it's in a Caribbean Studies journal. If you want a copy of it, I can send it to you. And we found that there was not enough saliency of the Puerto Rican issue at that point. This was early 1990s. So there was a lot of lack of understanding of the issues of Puerto Rico. But we found, and in that sense, what we understood was that the so-called Puerto Rican status issue is too far removed from congressional election or re-election concerns in order for it to become a salient issue demanding significant attention. That is what we concluded in early 1990s. It would be very interesting to do a study of this with you after Maria, after everything that has happened on the issues of Puerto Rico. What we observed that in particular districts where there were more than 10% of Hispanic voters, of Latino voters, there was much more interest and a tendency to try to help Puerto Rico. So we, in many ways, validated the electoral connection issue. Another recommendation that I would make is to be very cognizant of the differences between the House and the Senate. My own sense on this issue is that to the extent that the legislation in last years has been more in favor of admitting Puerto Rico as a state, that has generated a negative reaction on the part of the Senate, where the Latino population is concentrated in some particular states. So an hypothesis here would be that the electoral connection probably is more beneficial for granting Puerto Rico changes, not necessarily statehood, but to act in favor of Puerto Rico or to give parity to federal funding, etc. That probably is has a much more favorable environment in the House than in the Senate. The other important institutional difference is that there is a resident commissioner in the House that in many ways have the same responsibilities of legislature. Of course, he doesn't vote, or she doesn't vote in the committee of the whole at the end. It just does not have a vote in the final tally of the House of Representatives, but can lead the process at the committee level, can be in charge of committee recommendations. It can be the chairman, chairwoman, or of the chairperson of the committees in the House. So it's a very different environment. And I think one area of study would be to see how different resident commissioners have used this important access in the House to advance the status agenda. Another important consideration to take into account when researching these issues in the US Congress is to be very aware of the conversation that is taking place between the Supreme Court and the US Congress about the future of the territorial system. Many of us believe that it is no coincidence that Sanchez Valle, a case that basically said that Puerto Rico did not have any kind of political sovereignty, that it was in the hands of US Congress to do basically whatever change it could with Puerto Rico, that was done at the same time that the Promesa legislation was being adopted by Congress. And that same type of conversation is taking place now when the Supreme Court is considering whether to allow or not the parity of federal funding in some important federal programs. So again, as we study Congress, we should study it in relation to the other branches of government and how they interact, how they send political messages one to the other. Another route of research that I think would be interesting is to see to what extent those legislatures that have been more interested and active in the status issue have done so because of their links to political movements in Puerto Rico. And in the case of Ronald Dellums, it's known that he had a very strong connection with the independentista movement in Puerto Rico and with Juan Maribras in particular. One thing that could be explored also is someone like Don Young, the representative from Alaska, to what extent the relations that he has cultivated or the relations that Puerto Ricans have cultivated with him also help to explain why he has been so active in this issue. The other topic that I think is important is to not to concentrate exclusively in legislation that is directly related to status. That sometimes it can be a legislation on federal parity in federal funding that is not in it itself a political status question, but has a lot of consequences on political status. If Puerto Rico gets parity of federal funding under the Commonwealth, it can be argued that it helps Commonwealth. It can be argued also that it has some consequences in terms of let's continue the process towards statehood, but don't look the product by its label. So there are processes that are not explicitly about status, but they have a lot of impact on the status debate.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Jose Javier Colón Morera. I would definitely now take the opportunity to invite our presenter, Charles Robert Venator Santiago, to join us for the Q&A that has been going in the Q&A function in Zoom. But I think that this is time now to hear that conversation live. And what I have noticed in terms of the comments in the Q&A, I see two sets of comments. We have the more technical, research focused, factual, like, what's in it, what is in the database, what is in the project. And even though you have provided some answers to that, Charles, I think it's important to repeat some of the features of the database, and then we can get into the more interpretative or politically infused or inflected commentaries and questions that have come up in the Q&A and in the chat. And so perhaps to take it up from the top, what's in it? What's in it, and what is available for the public to do whatever the public wants to do with it, whether it is research or form and inform public policy. What's in it? Is it legislation? Is it debates? Is it hearings? What's in it?
So thank you for this opportunity to share my research with all of you. So let me give you a little bit of background before I can answer that. For the past 10 years, I've been collecting all of the status and citizenship legislation for all the territories. I went through the Congressional Research Index from 1898 to the present, line by line, on the relevant sections, and identified all the status legislation, or all the legislation that has to do with status and citizenship for Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Marianas, etc., Virgin Islands, and Guam. And the original idea is to create a territorial database that has all these materials publicly accessible. I collected the legislation, but I also collected the legislative histories. Legislative histories are the documents that explain the legislation, that are related to the legislation. And these include hearings, congressional reports or Senate reports. This may include additional external reports. It includes votes, it includes summaries of the legislative histories, etc. We have all that organized and cataloged. And I originally started by creating the Puerto Rico Citizenship Archives Project, which should give you a sense of where the kind of work that I'm trying to do with this. So the first phase is going to focus on simply releasing the bills with short narratives that are going to help to contextualize this. Now, we're simultaneously, we've built an Excel spreadsheet with 141 bills and upwards of 30 categories that include partisanship, sponsors, location, committees, every major publicly available information from the bill, including transition provisions, etc. So we're now in the phase of cleaning up. The idea is that we've shared this with other people, and they're saying, listen, you have a mistake here, or you should clarify this, or you should expand this. We're cleaning that database up, or that Excel spreadsheet. We've already done one initial coding and moved it to a statistical database program, which allows us to pull out patterns, to create graphs and charts that can help us compare and contrast. So some of the information that you saw earlier includes, political parties and positions and types of legislation. We can expand that to make different kinds of comparisons. And I am getting some helpful feedback from the Q&A so that I can respond to those questions. And I'm working with a colleague here at UConn to situate this debate within sort of relevant literatures. For example, there's a question about co-sponsors. How many bills have how many co-sponsors historically? Are they Democrats, Republicans? And we want to situate those debates within the literature. A lot of people suggest that co-sponsors sometimes are friends of friends or friends of the sponsor who owe a favor, who want to put their name, knowing that the bill's not going anywhere. But that has some sort of weight. But the idea is that we're going to make that information available to the public at some point, as soon as we have it cleaned up, so that people can start pulling out some data on their own. And again, this is going to depend on the available technology, or can identify issues that they can then compare. For example, to pull on a on a question that, or on a comment that Javier Colon raised earlier. It would be great to see whether sponsors from New York, from legislators, are coming from a particular district or representing a particular district that has a heavy Puerto Rican population. And that can be discerned by looking at census data historically. You can go to Vito Marcantonio's district and see what's the Puerto Rican population. And here, again, this is a collaborative effort with Centro to try to identify possible research approaches. I have not done that. This is a lot of work, but my goal is to make this information available so that researchers, young or more senior, can then grab these materials. Okay, so in the first phase, we're just going to release the bills and narratives contextualizing the debates Congress by Congress in different periods. In the second phase, hopefully, and again, this is depending on what technology is available, we're hoping to incorporate a public database that can enable either people to pull questions or to ask us questions that we can then answer and make them publicly available. But again, the idea is that this is an internet dynamic database that can be can receive feedback and can grow eventually. In a third phase, the goal is to include the legislative histories, newspaper articles, and other archival materials for each individual bill. And we already have all the material organized and cataloged. It's just a matter of, pacing ourselves with work. And then in a subsequent phase, we want to do a comparative approach where we can include UN data, Puerto Rico data on the plebiscites in Puerto Rico, in a comparative dimension with other territories, American Samoa, Virgin Islands, Guam, and Mariana Islands. And again, we have all that information. It's just a matter of time and resources. This is just a massive project. It takes a lot of time and resources to go line by line and make sure you get it right, because mistakes are publicly challenging. But yes, we hopefully, before we get to those other phases, if you have a particular question, you can email me, and we might be able to generate a table from this that can make that data available to you ahead of time. I can't promise, but I can promise to try.
Right. So there are going to be 4 phases. The first phase will be the legislations as it was introduced, whether in the House or in the Senate, that will be available, that it comes from the proceedings of the Congress, right?
Yeah.
And then ultimately, it would include all the material that legislatures have available themselves in order to weigh in on the different bills. And ultimately, all the pieces of information that relate to the bills, to the hearings, that may be informing the public discourse on the status issue. Very well.
Yeah, and eventually, hopefully, if we can figure out the technology, we'll have a database that allows people to do this kind of research on their own. Mm-hmm. But again, we have to work with different platforms, technological platforms. It's more complicated.
What specific questions about one specific bill is about the Puerto Rico Independence Act introduced by Vito Marcantonio in the 1940s. I don't know if you know. You made allusions to the legislation that Vito Marcantonio had introduced in Congress, I believe. Do we know of any specific bills in regards to Puerto Rican independence that Vito Marcantonio may have introduced?
Yes. Vito Marcantonio, I believe 7 bills, mostly either independence or a declaration of sovereignty. In other words, the United States would immediately leave Puerto Rico and declare that Puerto Rico was a sovereign nation. And he was introducing a number of bills that were very different to the other independence bills at the time, specifically of Tidings bills, who was his sort of contemporary. And these call essentially for withdrawal of sovereignty, withdrawal of the United States, immediate withdrawal from the United States, immediate naturalization of Puerto Rican or U.S. citizens as Puerto Rican, or denaturalization of Puerto Ricans, and special migratory provisions, and some transitional provisions that would help Puerto Rico realize its independence. Tidings offered a different kind of, the other independence bills that were offered at the time were more along the lines of the Platt Amendment. So the idea would be that Puerto Rico would become a sovereign nation, but it would retain a military base under the control of the United States, and the United States can intervene whenever its economic interests were at stake. And these were generally introduced simultaneously. When Vito Marcantonio would introduce a bill, Miller Tidings would introduce a counter bill in the Senate, and other lesser sponsors.
Mm-hmm. Another specific question, you did make a point of saying that in some of the early legislation, in particular, Congress was very specific about what they meant by different status option, right? And one of the questions that comes up from the audience is, how many of any of this legislation addresses the right of Puerto Rico to achieve independence as a sovereign nation?
Let me see if I can rephrase that question so I understand the language, because part of the problem is that there's language all over the place. So that suggests that Puerto Ricans would have a stake in defining themselves, the status. There's no status. Is that what you're suggesting?
If in the considerations in the Congress about the status of Puerto Rico, particularly as it respected independence, if there was a clear definition of independence of Puerto Rico as a sovereign nation.
Yes, there were multiple definitions. Miller Tidings had the clearest definitions, and Vito Marcantonio before the 1950s. After the 1950s, there's something interesting, because there's a period between the 1960s and then the Dellum's calls for self-determination, where there's a tendency to see bills that strengthen the so-called Compact of Free Association. And let me clarify this. The legal language that Congress adopts is the language of a compact between the Commonwealth and the United States. This is the language that's used in the UN. The legislative histories behind the reports and hearings, people say, that's just that's just public propaganda for the rest of the world to consume. But really, the status of Puerto Rico hasn't changed. It's still an unincorporated territory.
And that is what Sanchez Valles establishes.
Yeah,
and Franklin Trust.
Yeah, well, in some ways, but Sanchez Valles goes a step further, and because yes, there's a difference between the compact, but prior to that, there had been a recognition that the Commonwealth had some sort of autonomy. Sanchez Valles goes one step further and says, no, the Puerto Rican Commonwealth is just a simple territory that belongs to the U.S. and Congress has plenary authority.
Including the authority to grant it some sovereignty.
Including
Let me say something about it. There was an interesting article of two legal experts of Boston University, Lawson and what they Sloan and Lawson, and they said Commonwealth is not perfect, but it has a level of self-government that is enough to comply with international standards. The problem with Promesa is that right now, that is not real. Mm-hmm. Once you take out from Puerto Rico the capacity of dealing with the budget issues, it's very difficult to argue that Puerto Rico has enough self-government in order not to be labeled again a dependent territory under international law. It is true that in the United States, this is not an issue that garners a lot of attention, whether it complies or not with international law. But what I'm saying is that when legal experts from the United States were evaluating Commonwealth, said that they thought they had enough self-government, which is not the case now.
Mm-hmm. Jose Javier, I am going to ask you because there are some people in the audience who have asked what Promesa is. So can you very briefly describe what Promesa is?
Promesa is a very important legislation that created a mechanism by which Puerto Rico would face a very difficult situation that basically created a bankruptcy for the Commonwealth. Congress excluded Puerto Rico from the federal bankruptcy legislation. So Puerto Rico was basically did not have mechanisms to deal with bankruptcy. It created then an internal bankruptcy law, which the Supreme Court said that Puerto Rico did not have the power to do that. So basically, Puerto Rico was in some ways without legal recourse in front of a very massive 70 billion debt. So Congress decided to create a mechanisms by which a junta, a supervisory board, would be in charge of dealing with all aspects of the bankruptcy process, including the negotiation with the bondholders. And they would become part of the Puerto Rican government, and they would be at the same time federal officials, but performing internal duties of the territorial government. And right now they are in the process of trying to solve it's very unpopular in the island right now, but they have taken strong austerity measures. The University of Puerto Rico, we used to have like $900 billion. The budget, the last budget is $400 billion. So it is very controversial. And it's also controversial by the fact that when a state imposes a junta, a supervisory board over a city, which is generally the case, the legislatures are responsible electorally for that decision. But in our case, we cannot vote for the congressmen and congresswomen that are taking such a decision. So in many ways, it accentuates the problems regarding the status and the territorial status of Puerto Rico.
Mhm. So let's get now into, you already provided an overview of the factual aspects of the database itself. There are quite a few questions that are more interpretative or politically laden. So let's delve into some of them. And I want to actually take up a question for research that I think is very evident out there, which is, what are the political sources of support for legislation in regards to the status of Puerto Rico. Meaning, we have seen that historically, for instance, let's take the two organic acts, Foraker and Jones. They were introduced by the chairs of the committees that had oversight of Puerto Rico directly, right? So we see that to some extent, legislators who introduce legislation in regards to Puerto Rico, they do so from a functional perspective. They are the chairs or ranking members of committees that have oversight of Puerto Rico. But as you have also pointed out, Rob, yeah, Victor Marcantonio had a constituency that was Puerto Rican. More recently, we have two competing bills, one for the self-determination, one for statehood, one produced by a Puerto Rican representative from Florida, right, Darren Soto, and another one produced by Nida Velázquez, sponsored by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, both representing eminently Puerto Rican districts, although the proportion may be dwindling, particularly for the Nida Velázquez district. So there is that aspect as well. Then who else? Who else is introducing legislation? And to add to this is the fact that from the perspective of Puerto Rican politics, we know very little about how the U.S. government works in regards to Puerto Rico, particularly the U.S. Congress, which is to your point, right, Jose Javier?
Yeah.
We need to know much more.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to take the first bite and then leave it to Robert. It's interesting in many ways. The military was a very important organizing institution of the colonial regime, and somehow the lack of clarity on organization of what is going to be happening with Puerto Rico, some believe that it has to do, and I do also, of the relatively low profile that the military now is taking about the issue of Puerto Rico. They don't have the stakes that they used to have in the Puerto Rico debate. But the Department of War was always commenting every kind of political change, and Benatar has documented this very much. So now, after the Cold War, after the end of the intense use of military forces in Puerto Rico, it seems that like the environment is more up for grabs in terms of options of discussion. And the other comment I would say is that for some time, the only topic that was discussed in Congress was statehood, basically because the New Progressive Party had very effective gaining elections in the last 3-4 elections. So I see the Ocasio-Cortez, Nidia Velázquez bill as a way of trying to say they may be another routes that are not necessarily stable, and those are two competing narratives about Puerto Rico's future.
See, that's a really fascinating question. And from a historical perspective, it opens up a lot of answers. For example, Santiago Iglesias Pantin had a lot of support from the labor unions in the United States.
Right. That's right.
He was able to push a lot of stuff through.
That's right.
I'm still not sure where Millard Titans had his emphasis, but in his papers, he says, he was friends with some representative, a commissioner, police commissioner in Puerto Rico who was shot. So there are personal relationships. Some there are lobbying relationships. Some people are paid money to introduce this legislation, even though they know it's not going to go anywhere. There are personal friendships. I know for a fact that some political lobbyists in Puerto Rico, former officials in Puerto Rico, are constantly lobbying in the United States, it's other legislators. So I can't give you a straight answer, but what I can tell you is that in most instances, there is a personal connection from someone in Puerto Rico or someone in a district and a legislator, whether that's because of somebody worked in somebody's campaign or somebody has a lobbying relationship or there's money being exchanged.
Fundraising, yes.
Fundraising. I think
but those ones rarely make a difference.
Yeah, they don't go. There's some ideological positions that some lawmakers actually believe in this kind of stuff, But again, you take the case of Don Young. He says he's supportive of statehood, but his bills rarely come out defending statehood or advocating statehood. They talk about self-determination. They talk about the will of the people. So in that sense, I think the task for a good researcher would be to follow the biographies. I mean, I give some hints and I can tell you some stuff, but I don't understand why Larry Craig was introducing legislation, or for someone from Wyoming or someone from Wisconsin is introducing legislation at the time.
For example, Miriam Ramirez de Ferrer had a very good relationship with Herbert Bush, the president, and
Don Young too.
And Don Young too. Yeah.
No, I mean, there's some agricultural lobbies that are linked to plantations. There are all kinds of business interests that are linked to the question of Bill's support.
Well, Rob, Charles Venator Santiago, and Jose Javier Colon Morera, thank you very much. I just want to give you an opportunity. Time is escaping, running through our fingers. There are a few questions still left on the Q&A board that we will not be able to get to. But if you will have some closing thoughts, please, by all means.
Have it?
No. This is your thing.
No. I just have three thoughts. The goal with this project is to provide a historical dimension to debates. As Javier mentioned earlier, when you look at the Department of Justice memorandum analysis of the current political debates, they start from the 1991 period and ignore all this history. And I want to say, listen, there's a richer history of debates. Right now, we're focusing on federal legislative debates, because that's the other thing. A lot of people focus on the Puerto Rico plebiscites, but ignore the federal legislative debates. I want to say, listen, at the end of the day, Congress has to make the final determination what status Puerto Rico is going to get, unless Puerto Ricans force Congress to make a decision. But right now, we're not seeing, or historically, we haven't seen enough of a unity among the Puerto Rican population to choose one particular position over another. We have a fairly fragmented field in Puerto Rico. Some people try to force this unity with different kinds of models, that particularly referendum legislation. So the second point that I want to highlight is this information is helpful to understand the different mechanisms that are used to try to manipulate votes, to move votes, to close ranks in one status option or another, particularly with a status bill that doesn't give another option, that simply is a referendum, yes or no on statehood, for example. And then, related to that is the question of whether Puerto Ricans can participate in this process. And I think there is a history that shows that it is possible for Puerto Ricans to participate in either a status convention or some sort of convention that allows them to be a participant in their own future and their own destiny. The third dimension of this project, which I want to emphasize, is that I want to make this a public collective project. I can't guarantee that I'm going to be able to respond to all questions, but I can guarantee that I will try to take into account public feedback to make this a richer, publicly accessible document that makes information available to people who don't have special accounts in a Research One university like UConn, or can travel to Washington, D.C. and spend, 6 summers scanning microfilm in a basement in the Library of Congress or in the Law Library of Congress. I mean, it is, again, to make these resources publicly available so that people can develop their own research agendas. And hopefully they can come up with more interesting and more creative ways of thinking about this problem.
Jose Javier.
I really thank you for this opportunity. I think this is the start of of a very interesting journey that will expand the knowledge that we have now about a very important topic. And I want to underscore again, this is a topic where many people have many opinions, but many times it's not backed by hard facts. And this project will help.
Well, thank you, Jose Javier Colon Morera and Charles Venator Santiago for this presentation and the insightful commentary on very pertinent issues of Puerto Rican politics. We encourage the audience to stay tuned to this project, which will provide useful and necessary information to inform the political status debate about Puerto Rico.